Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to Scale Adventures. It's a podcast series we've been doing with software services leaders. And I have with me Keith Webster. He's the CEO of Terracor, and he's very graciously accepted to be on my podcast. Keith, I want to welcome you on behalf of my team and folks that watch this on LinkedIn. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for putting this together. I really do appreciate it. It's nice to get an opportunity to speak and have people hear what I have to say. So I do appreciate it.
Yep. And I enjoy it because as somebody who's building a business, it's always a chance to learn, to get to know you better, get to know your journey a little better. So I was thinking, Keith, before we dive into the details, we find that business leaders make their introductions much better than we ever will. So if you would just introduce yourself for our audience, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give a really quick intro of myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about Terracor, just to set some context. As you said, I'm the CEO of Terracor. We're essentially a mid-sized company. Because of that, I take on a few additional roles, we'll say, within the organization. One of the big ones is really front and center with our clients. So I typically do our account management, just get in front of our clients, keep active conversations going, make sure they're happy. And I also lead our sales and marketing initiatives as well. I handle pretty much all of our initial sales, and I work with our partners on our marketing initiatives as well. And then to round it out, of course, being the CEO, I typically drive all of our strategic initiatives in the company, whether that's building out a business plan or executing with the team all of the different initiatives. That's another big focus of mine as well. And with that said, as I said, I'll give a little summary of Terracor and what we're predominantly involved in. So we are a software and consulting company, but with that in mind, we really are best positioned in the e-commerce space, I'll say. So whether it's all different aspects of e-commerce, but what we really look to focus on is partnering with companies who typically either don't have an online presence or maybe they do, but it's very, let's just say, old legacy kind of presence. And we like to bring them online with automation, with integrations, and just generally the way we do things, we're very hands-on. So we like to partner with very specific companies, bring them online and give them that e-commerce presence they're maybe after.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think two interesting strands here. One is a repeating pattern we've noticed with CEOs of companies at your level, which is you have to be across a few functions, right, to really see and drive that growth. And I think the other part, what's interesting is we've been seeing software consulting companies where some are focused and some are a little bit broad and generalist. And I'm wondering, even before we dive into this a little bit more, why did you all pick e-commerce? And tell us a little bit more about why that world is interesting to you.
That's a good question. It's a complex one because of how Terracor started. I won't get into details, but we did start as an IT company. Essentially, it's just traditional IT services on site, as an example. And so how we actually got here was, it's similar to how we do a lot of things at Terracor is when we're talking with our clients and we're listening to our clients and they tell us about their needs, we look at how can we solve that need. And so back almost 20 years ago, I think it was, we have had a couple of clients come to us and say, hey, we need to sell online essentially. And that was just simply the beginning. We decided from there we would build out the platform, bring them online, and then work with them towards deploying that and supporting it. So that was just the beginning. This is before I was even the CEO. I was actually a developer at the time. But over the years, we transitioned out of the IT side and more into the e-commerce side because the space was growing. We had more and more clients with that need. And being a kind of a technical person and a software developer, I found just the space really interesting because as the need was growing, as Amazon was gaining a massive presence, as a good example, we'll say the options and the opportunities within e-commerce were just really interesting. It was a good technical challenge, and it was fun in a sense to work with our clients towards resolving those challenges. So that's the main reason we got into it, and why we're here today is just to, I guess, add something that you didn't really add, but you commented on some technologies, our technology companies being very broad in their scope of what they offer, and some being very focused. So we started very broad, but as time went on, we realized the need to focus is paramount, essentially. It's something we'll probably get into later in the podcast. So we decided really to focus on e-commerce as a hub, we'll say, and build all of the options around that so that we can really focus, we'll say, on a specific area of people's needs and business.
One of the things that I ask business leaders is to tell us a story, an example of a challenge that a client would come to you typically in the e-commerce space, just so it comes alive.
Absolutely. I do have several offhand because we're actually right now putting together some white papers, we'll say. So
Mhm.
I actually have a few
Perfect.
clients, but there's one, I won't mention the name. I'll mention their challenge. I hope it's not too complex, so I'll try and keep it really simple. But essentially, this company, they sell online, they sell thousands, actually tens of thousands of products, but they're a drop shipper essentially.
Mhm.
And the big challenge for them was because it's so competitive, margins are so fine, they needed to be as lean as possible. Essentially, we need to automate almost 100% of what we do in order to stay competitive, which is an incredible undertaking if anybody's ever tried it. So, one of the big challenges with them was they have multiple suppliers, multiple different costs. And then, how do they work with all the suppliers, deliver those products at the minimal selling price to their customers, while making sure they still make profit, their suppliers are well served, we'll say, online. So what we ended up having to do was build in a whole automation suite for them using our existing tools. We built out their e-commerce front end. This is where their customers will typically go online. They'll see customer specific pricing, they'll see accurate and live inventory levels and be able to complete the online shopping. But then from there, we needed to download the order and then automatically look at who can fulfill that order based on the vendors they have, the stock those vendors have, which we had to pull from their systems, and put all that together while then calculating the next selling price based on availability. Along with that, we built out integration to Amazon and eBay, and altogether, the level, as I said, of automation and workflow we implemented for them essentially allowed them to go from, I believe it was 6 people down to 2, essentially, just by automating out all of those processes and just keeping the minimal number of people they needed for, we'll say, more value add tasks as
Mm,
opposed to
mm.
those more low value ones, which I'll probably talk about a
Right.
bit later as well. So that was a massive challenge. That was a multi-year project, actually.
Mm.
But it was incredible to see it at the end and just to see when talking to them what it did for their business, how it's enhanced them, made them competitive, and again, why it's going to be an upcoming white paper. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm hearing not just software consulting, not just the implementation, also the business model, also the optimization, also the change management. Like I heard multiple layers in there. You were skipping over entire chunks as you were covering that. You mentioned that this is a multi-year project, right?
Yeah, it is because typically how we build things out when they're complex is we try to do it in phases or stages.
Mm.
Main reason being you take on too big a project, it can easily fail for several
Mm.
reasons. The needs can change during it, and then trying to be flexible or agile, I would say, within those changing needs can be difficult. So it's best to, and the way we look at things is when we're doing our discovery with a client and trying to scope something out, we say, what is the minimal valuable piece or unit that you would need in order for this to be useful and provide benefit? So we scope that out and ensure that we can implement that quickly. So the company in question can start to take advantage, we'll say, of these optimizations or the solution we put in place for them. And then what we do from there is we'll then say, okay, now we know where we are. What's next? What makes sense next? What is going to be the next thing that will provide value? Build on what we just did and allow us to keep working through this. It gives the client a time to breathe between phases. Let's just say they want to take on something else or they're busy. It lets them maybe rethink, re-strategize. And so over time, we might build something for 2 months, take a break for a month, build for 3 months, take a break again. And therefore, it does take, as I said, multi-years, but the good part is iteratively, we build out value and usefulness over time. And then the customer can base next decisions on what we've just done. So it's a really good strategy. It served us well, especially lessons learned from not doing it that way in the past. And yeah, and for that reason, as I said, we typically use that as our model moving forward.
Got it. Yeah. And I think the multiple benefits of it, not just being agile, but the time to value, the flexibility that they have, the flexibility you all have, then to be able to model something more clearly. Keith, what was interesting, and you mentioned again in a passing sentence, which was when I was not CEO, but a developer. And it just struck me that you've now played every role in the company, perhaps other than finance.
Yes, I think the only thing I haven't done is the IT side where I'm working with servers and computers. And even then, there was a little dabbling in that. But you're right, I even do some admin work at times. So it's a little bit of everything, which is funny because it's a challenge when you first do it.
Right. The
but it's
context
also really
switching and all
rewarding.
of that.
Yeah, it's really hard with the context switching. That makes it tiring and frustrating at times in a way. But it also means that you know your whole business too. That's the one thing I realized was when I became the CEO, I really took on the challenge as not a developer per se, but definitely a technical person. And that's why if we look at our current focus, it's all about where my strengths are, where my comfort levels are, where I think I'm best placed. But then within that, by taking on all these other pieces, stuff that I didn't traditionally do, it means you can get a good broad idea of the whole business. And I think it gives a much more balanced approach to how you handle things. Instead of looking at everything from a tech-centric standpoint, now you bring in, I know how the customer is going to feel. I just talked to one and heard either how happy they are, or maybe if they're frustrated on something, versus trying to sell something. And if a product is deficient or it doesn't present well, now I can go back and say, here's some information from me trying to sell it and how it presented itself and all the way around. So it's been a challenge, but I wouldn't change it. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't change it because it just made a more balanced decision-making side of things.
So I want to build on that question, and I want to look at this more from the journey. As somebody building a business, what have been, looking back, the hindsight wisdom? I was also curious because now you've played a developer role, you've played a sales and marketing role. What have been the changes in your thinking about sales and marketing? What has been the changes in your thinking about business in general when you look at that journey?
Good question, big question, because it's changed fundamentally everything. That's the summary, but in a bit more detail. As a developer, like any role actually, if you're essentially doing one specific type of thing, you're in one specific type of mindset, you do look at problems, or at least most people look at problems with that specific context in mind. So I'm a developer, I'm going to look at things from a technical perspective. So if an issue comes to me or somebody pushes in a feature request, sometimes you'll typically look at it like, technically this doesn't make sense, or technically this isn't clean and I don't like it, and therefore you might push back. But then moving into something like a sales role or an account management role, it fundamentally changes that, because you no longer look at it that way. It's not about just the technical challenge, which is important, but now that I have that kind of side of my thinking, we'll say, from the development side, it now, we'll say, rounds things out a little bit further by looking at it from how do we make the product better, regardless of technical challenges for now, so that it's easier to sell and market. But also, how do we listen to what our clients want, and again, look at novel or really good solutions to those problems, again, without worrying too much about the technical side for now. Let's work with them towards flushing those out and providing them with what they need. And then when you hit an actual technical challenge, instead of deciding, oh, maybe this isn't a good idea, look at alternatives. You just start really looking at it from both the developer standpoint, because you have to, but also from the client's perspective. And that just changes fundamentally how you look at software, which is one big change in me that I noticed over time. And it also changed how you scope out things. Again, you learn to compromise with clients, and you learn to have more of a balanced approach with how you scope out a solution, because sometimes there's more give and take. Mistakes can be made. Maybe a client is struggling with a little piece of discovery or whatever, and you learn how to work with them towards maybe flushing things out better, bridging those gaps. And like I said, when things go wrong, you can have a more balanced approach to resolution, as opposed to, I did what was in scope from a development perspective, and now it's up to you, client, to deal with that. And that changes that fundamentally as well. And then, running the business just was even a level, multiple levels above, because now you have to look at everything. You have to look at not only how do I tackle challenges and problems, how do I deal with people? The HR thing that I talk to other CEOs, it's always the biggest challenge, but trying to come to terms with dealing with individuals and groups, and trying to make sure there's a balanced approach to keeping everybody as happy as possible, to dealing again with these multiple roles and trying to make sure one doesn't overtake another, that you're still building and growing the company while still knowing that you have to work in the business of it. My ideal goal would be to get out of that, but right now I have to acknowledge that I have to do certain things in there, but ensure it doesn't overtake everything else as far as driving things forward. And with that, it's again changed everything. It changes how you look at all of your problems, all of the situations, how you deal with people. And again, it's a lot, but it's one of those where, again, it's an extension on what I just said about moving into sales and account management. I think it just makes you an overall better professional. I think it's probably the best way when you're dealing with people on all those different levels, and you're trying to pull it all together to make sure that you got that good balance, which I never would have had before.
And you mentioned a couple of times on this, I'm trying to touch the different topics, right? You mentioned a couple of times about white papers and about the way you are approaching your marketing now. Can you talk us through what has been the evolution of thinking and how you're thinking about marketing in the coming months?
Absolutely. So up till very recently, we never did any marketing. That's something when I tell people, they almost seem surprised. But a lot of small companies don't, even in our industry, for several reasons. One, how do you best approach it? Do you know exactly what you're looking for in terms of marketing? You have to have a strategy up front to like, why am I marketing? What am I hoping to get out of this? And then obviously you have to have the funds for it too. Like marketing and doing it well can be very expensive. I'm not talking here about getting yourself on LinkedIn or pushing a few posts. We've tried that in the past internally. Maybe somebody might take on the role a couple of hours a week, but it's one of those things where you really have to take it on. Like you have to do it right. But really in the last couple of years, not too long after I took over as CEO and started to focus things, again, it changed the way I was thinking, because now I had to imagine I'm not only working on the product with the team, I'm not only selling it and doing high level support, we'll say on the account management side, I now have to grow this business. So when you look at it with, again, going back to what we said about pulling all those roles together and fundamentally changing, I realized marketing is something we have to do. Instead of worrying about how and why, just say you have to. And now let's start working out what we need to do. So really my main thing I did from there was I tried to find a really good partner to work with, knowing that our internal people couldn't take it on for us. They're working on our clients' projects after all. I went on a bit of a research binge, we'll say, to try and find the best companies to work with, companies that I thought aligned with Terracor, because we like partnerships. Like even when we're working with our clients, we like when we're like-minded, or we like when it's more of a synergy as opposed to just a client company or partner relationship. So just went off, eventually found the right partner to work with. And from there started to build out the marketing strategy slowly. Essentially, we started with just our messaging, like who are we? If in one sentence I had to describe who Terracor are, what is that? Then from there, what sort of branding would be like? How do we want to be perceived? Do we want to be a corporate looking presence online? Do we want to be a little bit more technical looking, a bit more fun looking? Just make a decision on what do we want to project based on now we know what our focus is and who we are, how best to project that. And then from there, starting to flush out things like better content based on what we had so that we can better portray our products. Started into blog posts. I think something that gets underestimated sometimes, but how do we start flushing out more strategic blog posts that would help build us up in terms of our SEO presence online? And now what we're looking at is the evolution of that. Now that we've got good content, we have a good strategy for blog posts, the next is videos, podcasts like this even, and white papers and case studies as well are the two big ones, because now that we're showing what we do and who we are, we now need to tell people why. Like, why would you want to work with us outside of the fact we have a nice website with some good content? What would be the benefit, and how can we show how we apply that to somebody either in a similar industry or with a similar challenge in terms of their business that we helped resolve? So that's why we're working on those now, to keep flushing out this strategy, just so at least we can keep building on what we already have.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? If you look at the conversation we've had, you've had a technical conversation, then you've had a sales conversation, then you've had a marketing. If you look at it, it's almost like it represents like a hierarchy of evolution, right? At each level, you're like, okay, this is not enough. You need to do the next thing. And that's not enough. You need to do the next thing. I think just maybe put the business conversation aside for a moment. And I'd just like to ask you is hindsight wisdom. What is something you would tell your younger self just around the way you've built this whole thing? Because it strikes me as you've rolled up your sleeves and really jumped into things that you've learned on the fly, is what it seems to me, right? And you've backed yourself to figure a way.
Yeah, it's another big question, because changing roles so significantly. And this is not to overemphasize, we'll say, the complexities and the challenges with being a CEO, but it couldn't be a bigger departure from anything I've ever done, is jumping into that role. And I think looking at the first 2 years were very challenging in lots of ways, adapting to the role, adapting how you handle situations, how you handle bigger decisions, we'll say. And honestly, the one thing that I would, if I could go back those few years ago and say to myself is, I know this is cliche, I hear a lot of people say, but get a coach. A lot of people say it and people are like, I've seen people roll their eyes, but once I started working with, say, other CEOs with a lot of experience, talking to them, hearing from them, how do they handle challenges? What sort of strategies have they employed that have worked? And then how maybe to translate that to our business. That was massive, because going through 2 years trying to come to terms yourself and having nobody within, we'll say, that same role to speak to or to work with, I would say just working with other CEOs, within just 3 months, I did more and grew more into the role in those 3 months than I did the previous 2 years. And just moving on, making sure I continuously have people that I can work around with me. You could be part of groups. There's lots of groups out there. People know about developer groups and things like that, but there actually are like CEO ones. And
Right.
I would say to the younger self or to anybody becoming a CEO is honestly just get involved in one of those groups. You'd be stunned at what you could learn and how it will help. Even again, somebody said it's one of the loneliest roles as the CEO role, because nobody in the company knows what you're challenged with. Nobody knows what you're really thinking and what you have on your shoulders. So if you are around other CEOs, they know. And therefore, just that alone can make you feel that comfort that, hey, there's other people like me here. And as I said, if you can get a coach as well, somebody that wants to help, somebody that can help, the big one is pushing you, like somebody that just won't take, I don't have time for this, or I couldn't get to that. They'll always say, then when, just pushing you to make sure you're always on top of things, always challenging yourself and always executing what you said you would. That would be a massive one for me. That would be the number one, actually, that I would say to, I say young Keith, it was Keith 4 years ago, whenever it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine who just raised a round of funding. And he said, when you're CEO, sometimes a year is actually 4 years. It's 3 years. It's not a year, because you're just going through so much unknown. And it's almost like he's a little geeky. So he was saying it is the number of new experiences over a period of time that matters. It's not the time frame alone that matters, right? And as a CEO, like you could be doing a sales thing and then you're in a marketing meeting and then somebody's threatening to quit and God knows what, right? No, I hear you on that, Keith. And then something that I have enjoyed in this entire conversation is how open you've been on the learning curve. That I think the flip side of this is we see movies where CEOs are like rock stars. And it's especially for people who haven't been in roles like that, it's not so obvious, the struggles. And I think one thing I'm taking away from this conversation is how open you've been about that journey. I want to now, from looking to the past, I want to look to the future a little bit as my closing question, or we'll see if there's some other question that comes up, which is just a little bit about, you've come in, you've focused the business, you've started amping up the strengthening the sales, doing the marketing part. Where do you see the next 12 to 18 months? Let's say it's a home run, right? And we're chatting in 12 to 18 months. Where do you see it? What are some thoughts you have in terms of direction?
Sure. So we're already planning out 2023 at this point internally. And we know specifically what we're going to focus on. So we'll go over that in a second. But I think by just planning things out the way we're doing it and seeing where it's going to go, one thing we realized was we're not just planning what are our major objectives for 2023. What we've noticed is each objective is almost like a follow-on from this year's. You made a comment earlier about how I seem to be almost building a bit of a hierarchy of things. And this is similar, like we're building on a hierarchy of, I always use the term internally about continuous improvement. Again, another cliche kind of one, but it's something I always sit with, because when you're mirrored in the details, and it's easy to forget the small improvements. So I always say, don't worry about it. As long as we're always improving, focus on that. And 2023 is going to be something along the lines of that, which is I'll go over a couple of the major ones, because it culminates into being able to do certain things maybe that wouldn't have been as easy before. So one of them is actual focus. Just one word, of course, there's more to it, but we've already focused our messaging. We focused generally the major industry, like we're predominantly in the B2B space, really. But what we want to do is focus it down even further based on the challenges we face, whether it's stiff competition or technology changes. What we really want to do this year is take a step back and say, okay, what are our primary products and services? And really analyze and assess them and make sure, we call it like, what is the current mode of operation for those? What is the future mode of operation? And then perform like a gap analysis in the middle. Really what we want to do is we want to get each of those and we want to make sure they're highly polished and that whatever we offer is a highly professional solution. Again, because we have to at this point in time, we have to make sure that every year everything is up to snuff, so to speak. Because you can easily have a good solution today, in 2 years it's fallen off the rails. Maybe you haven't kept up with technology. Maybe your competition has a better feature set. So we want to make sure that we really focus on the main core products. And as I said, add that level of polish to those so that we can confidently bring those to market, along with really refining our partnerships. That's a big one for us. We have several partnerships, but we want to go in and really start talking about how do we better focus our effort with our partnerships, in particular our integrations. We integrate with a ton of different systems, but how do we pick the primary ones and make sure we got really strong strategic partnerships so we can grow alongside our partners. So that'll be a big one to help us focus on an area that'll help product, sales, marketing, and the company growth strategy completely. Another big one, again, one word, because I guess I like to keep things simple, is automation. you could just change the workflow of a task in a project management system, and it auto assigns to this person and creates this other task. And just by doing little things like that, tiny bit of human error gone, that they might forget to do it or do it wrong, and a person's notified right away by just one click, just saves you maybe a minute or two there, but over time, that grows. And by assessing each of the automations we've done, we've realized that if we automate as much as possible within the business, we can make ourselves much more efficient over the next year, and therefore we have more time. And honestly, just to spend on, again, refining our products, working with our customers, and so on. So the automation one is going to be huge. We're going to try and automate 100% of what we have, if feasible.
Wow.
There's always be some manual process, but we want to look at it more from how can we maximize this because of, again, the benefits in turn.
Yeah, I think what was interesting to me is I was talking to someone recently and he said, good strategy is like music. It must be coherent. The fact that you have a segment and then you're pulling things together, and you also mentioned this thing about freeing up time to think, not just in the business, but on the business, right? And I think points you've made are echoing back again, right?
When you said a good strategy has to be coherent is a really nice way of putting it. It's a very, we'll say, subtle way of putting it in that, yeah, that's exactly it. Because one of the things I didn't touch on, because, well, you could talk about 100 things, is when we're building out our strategy as well, we also have a list of, we'll call them core values within the company. And what we try to do is apply those. Because if we have an objective that isn't aligned with those core values, it shouldn't be an objective. Because why are we even doing it if it isn't something that we're trying to achieve overall? And that's where I think the coherent side comes from, because we try to make sure everything works together. Because if our focus is on refining products, for instance, and automation, but how is that going to help other objectives? Because if that automation isn't going to allow us to better focus on the products, or like you said, allow me to better focus on the business and the strategy, and it doesn't align with those core values, again, what is the point? And that's a big change for us over the last couple of years as well, is making sure we look at everything at that level, as opposed to just picking an objective that sounds good. This sounds like something we should achieve this year, but why? It always goes back to we always ask the question why. And so that's, sorry, that triggered a couple of thoughts when you said that. So
no, I think the good design provokes responses, right? And what I'm hearing is the passion. People look at products and they can clearly see good design. Companies need to be designed well. And I think it's a much less appreciated art form, design companies. And as you can guess, you and I are probably going to be able to jam on this for a very long time if we let it go. And it's one of those things that only when you've built a company can you actually appreciate good design for a company, right? And that's why I was talking about this whole generalist versus focus. Anytime a company says we focus on X, I usually take that as an early sign that there is coherence in the strategy. And because that focus is actually not an easy decision, right? Essentially, you're saying no to a bunch of other things, right?
Yeah, that was a big challenge for us when we said, let's focus, even for the internal team, because like I said, we had such a broad set. It actually was more one of those where you just wanted to do what the client wanted to make them happy. And so when I first said, let's focus, you could tell people like, wait, so we're not going to do all these things. We're not going to do what these customers want, or these prospects. You're turning away business. And really, the best way to look at it is you're not turning away business. There's plenty out there. What you're doing is you're saying, we're going to focus on this so we can be great at it, for instance, or we can be the best we can be at it, and therefore offer a better solution to people. It is a change in mindset, especially when you come from a different mindset, but it does allow you now to just, like you said, design things out. I'd ask somebody, if they were starting, if you were to design the perfect company, what would it be, as an example? Like if you could start from scratch. But I think working through it, you really start to see, as you said, like what a well-designed company looks like, especially when I worked on one that had legacy components, we'll say, like old services, and seeing how they can impact the business negatively, versus when you design something well and you see just how well it can serve you and your people. That I think that was a big difference as well, is instead of going, we'll call it greenfield, so to speak, with a company, just doing it while trying to clean things up, we'll say, is an interesting exercise as well.
Yeah, and what we see is that the sort of the hierarchy of design is you go functional, then you go to sales, then you go to marketing, and then the highest level is when you look at your whole category and just be like, where is this going, and how do we get to where the puck is going, not just where it is right now, right? And I feel like if I let this go, we will go down another interesting rabbit trail. Keith, as always, just a pleasure to chat with you. Deep respect for the journey that you've been on, how you've backed yourself to take on the next thing, right? And Yeah, it's been my journey as well. I'm not technically focused, but I've taken on multiple roles. So I understand the difficulties of playing the game and learning, right? But just want to thank you so much for this podcast. It's been such a fun, honest, and I think that's what makes a podcast different from other formats of engaging, which is it should feel like two friends having a deep conversation, right? So I
Yeah,
just want to say
it's
thank
true.
you.
Oh no, and thank you. As I said, I do appreciate the opportunity to do this because, yeah, like you said, it's nice to come on and just you have some ideas of what you're going to talk about, but to not have an actual true agenda. Just I think when you and I first talked about this, I said I like to speak off the cuff for the most part. Sometimes it can be really good. It can get your point across, and sometimes it can meander a bit. But overall, it's a nice way to do it because it feels more casual and more genuine. So I do appreciate you putting this together. It's really good of you. So thanks.
Perfect.